Hello, everyone. Good evening and very welcome to this special edition of LIMA Online. It's the first in a series of two that we organize in collaboration with the London-based gallery arebyte. And we do so within the framework of a very special exhibition. It's called The Digital Weird, and it is co-curated by Jan-Robert Leegte. And as you can see, I'm here surrounded by quite some guests and moderators, and I'm very happy to introduce them to you. It's Erik Davis, our special guest of the night. He's an American writer and scholar, and you might know him from either Technosis or the Expanded Mind podcast, but I'll leave Jan-Robert to introduce him to you more properly. And I'm also here with Nimrod Vardy, who is the director of arebyte. So I think I want to give the word to you first, Nimrod, and introduce yourself and arebyte to all of us. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sanneke, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Jan-Robert for co-curating and for Erik Davis for joining this talk. Just briefly, Rebecca couldn't join us tonight, so I'm replacing her. Hopefully I can do as good job as she does. So I'm the founder and director of arebyte Gallery. We started in 2013. We're a gallery focusing and specializing in digital arts, both on-site and online. We've been curating and producing and developing our program since 2013. And this year's theme is the idea of realities, commissioning a series of solo and group exhibitions, both on-site and online. Having the privilege to work with Jan-Robert Leegte on this really incredible projects that I hope everyone experienced and had a chance to look at online. And having two other projects in the main gallery space. At the moment, we have Kent Francis Lingard, our Hotel Generation artist from last year. And coming up is Ben Grosser, opening in August. And in November, an exhibition by Danielle Breathway-Shirley. Looking forward to really seeing all these exhibitions coming to fruition after such a long time, and welcoming everyone to this talk. Thank you very much. To you, Jan-Robert.
Hey, thank you so much. Welcome everybody here at LIMA Online. So tonight we're gonna try and probe into the title of the show, which is The Digital Weird, and a lot of people I encounter are like shrugging, they're not completely sure what to do with it. But just to briefly introduce, I'm just going to share the exhibition page with you so you can have an idea what it looks like. I was invited before the pandemic by arebyte, and quite instantly I wanted to work with the digital weird as a subject. That came from actually a couple of years ago when I was suffering from climate depression and went back into, I don't know, I had a sort of instinctive search for some, I don't know, weird writers, and I'll even consider Sartre one, but also Lovecraft, and I started reading all that and it made me feel a lot better actually, and it sort of awakened this old passion of mine. And looking into this, and sort of I encountered this sort of new, what is it, discourse. Well, it isn't new because Erik has been doing it forever, but for me it was new. And that way I also came across sort of weird literature and the new weird literature, and also upon the work of Erik, and I started listening to his podcast and reading his book High Weirdness. Tonight we're gonna, so we made a show around this, featuring works sort of taken from an idea which I have, which is a more, I would say, an ontological approach to the weird, and there's of course a very social aspect, and it's sort of a mixture of both. But we're just gonna sort of freestyle into that world together with the expert. Let me again briefly introduce Erik Davis. Erik Davis is an American writer and a scholar and journalist, public speaker, podcaster. His book include the 90s Technosis, Myth and Magic and Mysticism in the Age of Information, and Nomad Codes, The Adventures in Modern Esoterica, and most recently the book I I started with was High Weirdness. His podcast, Expanding Mind, covers about 10 years of, I would call it, intense field work within the field of contemporary esoterica and technoculture and art and music. And he has a PhD in religious studies at Rice University, which I believe is the foundation of the book High Weirdness. And currently he's taking a break from his Expanding Mind podcast, which I would recommend everybody, which is an incredible, valuable, deep source of of discourse around what often used to be considered the troublesome subjects and sort of the subjects one didn't take serious, but Erik manages to take them really seriously at a perfect tone. And I would love to invite him to talk tonight about the sort of build up. I first want to sort of talk with him about what is weird. For a lot of people listening, it might be it might be like, I ate something weird last night, and so that isn't really we're going to talk about. Once we have that covered, we want to see what the relationship between weird is and art or fine art, and from that we want to I'm curious to see how the digital art takes place in that, going through cyberdelics in the 80s, 90s, and toward the situation currently. But of course, we'll get lost as the weird dictates. Hi, Erik.
Yep.
I've lost you in all my screens. Let me have a look. The weird. Let's start there.
Sure, no problem.
You had a fantastic definition in the beginning of High Weirdness, which was sort of threefold. I think you covered a aesthetic and a social and an ontological side. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. I think it's that's where I was going to go as well. I think it's really appropriate to specifically frame the digital weird. And just to say that I think that you're right, that the weird has become an emergent and now emerged discourse in the last 10 years, and that it's actually a really good way to try to get into a certain sense of our contemporary moment, because while it had precedence, I think there is something fresh, through Mark Fisher's work, through Viola Wilkes' essay that got around a lot, and through the self-consciousness of new weird writing. So in my book, which is focused on some psychedelic adventurers in the 1970s, and in some sense the 1970s in general, which I see as a particularly weird time. Maybe we can get back to that because there's some interesting 70s pieces in your show. But I knew I wanted to use this category of weirdness to describe these psychedelic experiences that were kind of religious and kind of not, and kind of profane and kind of crazy, but kind of beautiful. And what is this stuff? How do we call it? And I was attracted to that term. And as you said, part of the beauty of the term is that for a lot of people, it's kind of a trivial wastebasket term. It's sort of where you put things that are kind of uncomfortable, that don't really quite work. They can be trivial. They can be, darker than trivial. So like, I ate something weird, or I met this guy, he's kind of weird, but, just kind of an everyday term. Or you can have something very peculiar happen to you. Like you have a prophetic dream, like you have a dream and then you wake up and it's during the next day, something happens, and you're not a new ager. You don't believe that time doesn't exist. You don't think that you're a prophet. But what are you going to do with that experience, or a strange dream, or a glimpse of a UFO or something? Well, you go like, I don't know. It was weird. This weird thing happened. It's sort of this wastebasket term, which are always good places to work for new theoretical ideas. So I pulled in there and I pulled it out, and I was like, okay, so how am I actually going to use this? And I think then, like you said, there's three currents of it, all of which get played out in your show. The first is the most obvious, is the weird as a genre in the broad sense of the term. Something that we can relate to fantasy and the supernatural, to science fiction, to horror. It emerges historically at a certain point, and the term itself becomes used at sort of certain high moments in literature, like in Shakespeare's Macbeth, you have the weird sisters, and that's actually a new use of the term, which stretches back and has a more ancient sense of associated with fate. So one has one's weird as a kind of noun. And so then you get this sort of parallel, largely marginal stream through Gothic literature and penny dreadfuls, and then of course flowering in the early 20th century with Weird Tales, the great pulp magazine where H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard debuted Conan, and then my California favorite Clark Ashton Smith. I always got to give a call out to Clark. And, so Weird Tales kind of congealed this space that's not horror, not quite supernatural, but related to those, maybe with a little science fiction in it. And that has become this kind of current that has been revised and brought into freshness by lots of new writers and filmmakers and artists. And there's ways of talking about that, but it has a certain relationship to the supernatural, a certain relationship to darkness, but it's not quite as intense as horror, that you can have weird horror. We can talk more about it. But the second one is I think equally important and very much on point in your show. And the second one is a sociological sense of the term. And here I like to contrast weird and the uncanny. In many ways, there's a lot of overlap. People have uncanny experiences. They're kind of like weird experiences. There's uncanny works of art, weird works of art. They're not so different in terms of the content, but the social location of these terms is totally different. Uncanny is a highbrow term. It's a psychoanalytic term. It's a sophisticated term. A very well-educated 20th century person would refer to the works of Bruno Schultz as works of the uncanny, right? But weird is the opposite. It's lowbrow. It's crass. It's kid stuff, comic books, B movies, hot rodders, and also actual social deviance. So if you look at the history of the term, a weirdo in like the 40s often meant a pervert, potentially gay. So there's a weird actual resonance between queer and weird in a way that is complicated. I don't want to, just sort of summarize something that has a lot of complexities to it, but that's definitely there. So a weirdo is also a social outcast. It's a social position, not just a genre or an aesthetic vibe. And that gives it an extra punch. And I felt a lot of the works in the digital weird were also playing with that, with the way in which deviancy is still sort of an operation that makes sense in this new environment. I mean, at some point, I'm always waiting for that moment where deviancy doesn't work anymore because everything's been deviated from. And it feels like we're approaching that apocalyptic moment sometimes. And yet there's always another twist. So that quality of deviancy and the way it relates to the genre is really key. And then the third moment, which is something I had just kind of hinted I felt sort of intuitively, but is actually quite rewarding, looking at it, is this ontological sense of the weird. And here you basically say, well, what does that mean? It means that reality is weird, meaning that you can do all you want to do about explaining how things go with science, technology, critical theory, throw everything you want at it. There are things that exceed those networks, those web works, those languages, those gestures, those moves. And whether we think of it as something that has to do with the psyche, which is, okay, but I'm more interested in the large claim that the cosmos, part of the cosmos, not all of it necessarily, is weird. And that there's something ontological about the weird, such that when we're plugging into maybe just a genre, maybe a lifestyle, maybe a psychedelic experience, a kind of set of subversive practices, that it's not just that we're like messing with human codes and psychologies and cultural systems, that there's actually kind of a staging of an encounter with the outside or the beyond or the in-between. And that's something I don't talk about as much in the book, but I've been thinking about more, is the tension between the beyond and the in-between. And I think there's some interesting politics there as well. And just the kind of final little nail to put on that it's just sort of, you could say it's just a happenstance, but I don't think so, is the way in which the term weird was taken up by quantum physicists, people talking about quantum physicists, and not just pop science writers, but actual physicists, when they would go, look, there's incredibly counterintuitive things about quantum physics. They just don't work with us. They don't make sense. How could the world be structured this way? And you have to acknowledge that, even if you're doing science, which is dispassionate, it's just that this is the facts, just the facts, man. It doesn't matter because it's so counterintuitive. People started referring to quantum weirdness. And so quantum weirdness becomes like actually a sort of term, a gesture, a way of acknowledging the sort of counterintuitive aspects of physics. And so that just seemed a perfect like reminder that however confident you are about your model of the universe, even just looking at physics forces you to confront things that are deeply unsettling, disturbing, corrosive of humanism, corrosive of our confident sense of time and space and causality, dynamics, matter itself. And so that kind of weirdness is stitched into this stuff. And so that the weird becomes almost a multidimensional portal. You may start out just reading a science fiction story, but you find that somehow your perception gets rewired such that you're able to tap into potentially ontological dimensions of this, as well as very obvious social ones in terms of relating to dominant codes and the ongoing work of deviancy. So that's sort of the way I kind of laid it out. And this is a zone. And, there's a lot of other people doing interesting stuff with it. So I was really happy to see you pick it up and run with it as a conceptual frame to look at digital art. Right? So I thought it was a great idea.
Thanks so much. That's crystal clear. And I think for me, this ontological side has always been very clear. And I thought, as you said, that coining it weird has been very helpful to sort of discharge it, because there's always this, the experiences are often being drawn into positions of, God knows, enlightenment, religious things. It could be trances, visions. There's a very romantic notions often stuck to them. And it's also inspiration or sort of breakthroughs, or there's endless words for it. But they are very, in a way, it's good to sort of understand. Probably everybody has them, and they're sort of quite common, but they're often sort of somehow unspeakable or weirdly categorized, and people feel uncomfortable to sort of talk about them. And usually they're sort of they've been claimed by certain cultures, like religious or new age groups or gurus or God knows what, or psychonauts, or and I think people can sort of also, for the audience, I mean, people say like, I had a vision, or I had this breakthrough on DMT or God knows what, but it also happens when you just walk down the sidewalk, and you can sort of just, reality just switches and you see everything in a just different, you're like, what was that? And it's thinking about that over the years, I always sort of had the idea of sort of weird, and that's why it's such a great term. First of all, it's like uncategorizable because it's automatically anormal. It's not normal. It's leaving normality for a moment, wherever it goes somehow. And then it's probably too big to say it's another realm. That's how people then sort of categorize it afterwards. It's the same place seen differently just for a second, and then you're back into the place where you have categorized it or something. And that often seems like a good way to see it. That means like the weird is there all the time, and you're probably in it right now, only you're in this idea that you have it under control. That's sort of the way I've often seen it. And then people like psychonauts and shamans and mystics and artists and musicians that sort of professionally active to pierce this veil or to sort of jolt it and get some credits coming out. Sort of, it sounds pretty black and white. So I'm wondering if you sort of agree partly, or you want to nuance that.
No, I resonate a lot with what you say. I think particularly important is the quality of the secular or the profane. I think that was another reason that I was very interested in that, for the same reason that you mentioned, which is that whether you're talking about the supernatural as like a genre of narratives and experiences even, or you're talking about these sort of cognitive events that are peculiar and sometimes expansive and even marvelous, that there is a tendency to sort of congeal them in a religious language or spiritual language or transcendental language. And when you insist on the weird, a couple things happen. One is that you're kind of like almost saying for sure this is a secular term, and that allows a wider range of things to happen in there. You can still have, an experience, let's say a divine vision, and then some people the next day become religious. I'm converted, and other people go, "Whoa! Like, what am I supposed to do with that? That's pretty weird. Like to have Jesus come and knock on your door, or like glowing lights out of the sky, or whatever it is." And this tension is very much in. And that's probably why I did it in a book about psychedelics. It's very, for modern, in the modern era, where psychedelics are not just locked into some, a tribal framework of initiation, or even in sort of an ancient mystery tradition like the Eleusis. But for modern people, where you're buying a piece of blotter with a stamp of Mickey Mouse on it and having your trip, that there is this fundamental tension between the sacred and the profane in the experiential domain itself. And so for me, the weird is that tension. It's not just the profane, although it leans profane versus, sacred, but it's really more about the dynamic tension within the sacred and profane, or whatever that is, where you have both elements going on. And I think that's partly what makes it really productive and fundamentally ambiguous, and is to some degree uncapturable, because it is about liminality and the actual breakdown of the codes. The problem is, in a way, is that, and people have asked me this a number of times when I give them talks about it, go, well, what's happening to the weird today? Isn't it just becoming banal? And I'm like, yeah, in some ways, yes. Stranger Things is an awesome show, but with the 70s, with the early 80s aesthetic and the sound and everything, it's like, it struck me, I was the perfect demographic, and yet there's a kind of a more banal form of the profane that enters in once these things become circulated. And the same thing is happening with psychedelic culture. For decades, psychedelic culture is a unquestionably underground phenomenon, different undergrounds, some new age and religious, some weirdo freak artist type, some psychoanalytic trying to heal, but all definitely underground. And now it's just sort of part of the material that can be circulated and recirculated and commented on and parodied and, loops through TV shows and animation and all that. So in one sense, things are just getting weirder, particularly if we and I want to just talk about media now rather than what's happening in the physical world. And I still insist that there is it's worth making that distinction, even if it becomes less and less clear, that as those things get circulated. So in one way, everything's weirder, and which is why everything's crazy. And like QAnon just emerges out of nowhere, and suddenly it's like a social fact of enormous implications. And you're like, whoa, like where do I put this? And at the same time, and in a way that I think is deeply 21st century, it's banal. And whereas the weird in the past, banal wasn't quite right. Crass, maybe coarse, feverish, crude. Those are, that's going on there, but it's not quite banal because it's not recirculated through like conventional media and systems as much as it is now. So it's a weird tension between the weird, certainly as a current that comes through the ages and gets transformed in provocative and really innovative ways now, and it's sort of encountering kind of this banal, like the banal of social media or the banal of a Facebook post. And then are we weirder now, or are we de-weirding the weird? I'm not really sure. You know, I have certain ideas, but I noticed that when I look at art or writing or things that are really trying to not just talk about, but express, capture, resonate with the weird, I often find myself kind of on this little divide where I go, okay, that's kind of cliche and easy, and like, oh no, that was actually peculiar. And that's partly just me responding, gauging my own sort of desire and sense of interest in being proximate to that kind of space of ambiguity. And then also that I consume a lot of media. So it's like, you know, it's like an arms race of the weird. And so I mean, I have a lot, like going through the material in the show. I mean, one of the things I felt this is a peculiar reaction, is like, I felt a little bit of kind of sympathy and not pity, but a little bit of like, wow, that's really hard. Like, I really appreciating how difficult it is in a way. And I've seen other artists that you didn't include in that I can think of that do this, where they're really trying to still make art in this completely bizarre milieu, but it's so hard to get out ahead of the culture itself. Like, if you just go to 8chan and start looking at meme culture, it goes weird in like 5 seconds, and it's full on, and it seems self-aware, and yet it's not even clear if it is. So for artists to go in there and extract interesting moves within that is extremely difficult. And I was pretty impressed with how people work with it, but you can feel the proximity of what is the extra that art adds in this situation, because the culture itself is doing it. It's eating itself. It's mutating. It's becoming chimera after chimera, with irony looping into irony and perversion and, you know, intense, you know, whatever. It's just the whole thing is doing it on its own. So I admire the effort a lot. I think it's really important.
Yeah, no, that's very spot on. It's yeah, there's some, is it a tragedy? What's going on? Because I must say, personally, any sort of profound weird experience has been life-changing, or at least has had a very positive or definite effect. So I always, it could be me, but I've also, there's this rapid sort of cultural maybe appropriation of weird experiences which make it banal, but I don't think the experience itself ever is banal, and and they're always on a personal level quite special. But it's more like, yeah, it's I would say the appropriation of it, which also diffuses them and maybe makes people sort of feel less special about it or something. So there's a danger there, which it used to be more, they're guarded by a certain culture around it, which was subcultural. And maybe we just don't have the language now or the tools to deal with them on a sort of, positive way.
That's really a great thing. I mean, it reminded me of two things. We can talk about appropriation. That I mean, it's another conversation, but I feel like that concept has to be refined somehow. It's a little unclear always what's going on in that idea. I think another way of doing it, which has less to do with sort of power, is just recirculation. Whether or not you're analyzing it in terms of who has power and who's holding power, just the fact of our condition, a technological fact of our condition, is this intense recirculation. So, you know, as someone who went to Burning Man from 1994 through 2010, you know, I got to see it change as a place where it's extremely weird in the old sense of the term, underground, not circulated, not barely recorded, very peculiar, perverse, sacred, profane, the whole thing. And then watching how the technologies of recirculation kind of change it. And then finally going back there after 10 years of not going, like we're, 8 years, a couple of years ago, the amount of the way in which people were using phones and how they were staging themselves against backdrops. And then that's going to go on your Instagram page. And then you're living the life at the Burning Man, that circulation. Whether or not that's appropriation, I don't even know, but it is recirculation, and it does make a more claustrophobic space.
Yeah.
But there's something else that's happening, to pick up from what you said about the experiences themselves, that I am concerned about, which is that one reason that psychedelics are now becoming part of the dominant culture through pharmacology, through new medical discourse, ideas of healing, changes in regulation and law, a mainstream acceptance from places like the New York Times or the New Yorker that used to make fun of it if they even paid attention to it at all. Why is that happening? And I'm afraid that one of the things that's happening is that the corporate colonization of the unconscious has just found a whole new set of tools and tricks, and that we are actually sort of weaving our interior experiences, the marginal interior experiences, the ones that we don't have a language for, don't even really know how to make happen, that those are becoming more and more woven into the general circulation of images, affects, probes, algorithms, tricks, seductions, the whole kind of media sphere. So in some ways, I think that you got to hunt for those transformative, weird moments. And I find that when I watch, or just talk on the level of art and media, when I get that, I'm like, okay, they're working. You've got to strive. You can't just easily just kind of throw things together and get a kind of dark and add in some mutant imagery. It's like, that's not enough anymore. You got to work for it. But I agree with you that it's still, because I have this sort of sense of the ontological dimension of it, I always feel that beyond is still there in a way, outside of the circulation zone, or at least through cracks in it. And it's worth continuing to strive for that. And it's when people say there is no outside anymore, we're just inside of this circulation machine.
I don't believe that. Yeah. No, but it's very well put. I think that what I meant with the appropriations, exactly what you said, is this sort of this encapsulating in media, this singing around, this sort of in the even corporate aspect of it. It happens so fast that people don't have time to sort of reflect on that experience. It's just, and that is claustrophobic in a way. Let's take it to the 70s, one of your favorite periods, and also bridge a bit to the art strategies, and starting there, because I think that's very interesting. We have one work in the show from the Fazulkas made in the 70s using electronic media, which I find a very typical 70s work of art. And I also wanted to little bridge bringing in a Dan Graham work. When I was an early teen, that was probably my first recognition of a weird encounter, was me looking into the mirror as a young man, or 12, 13-year-old. And I came into this cycle of deconstructing your image from yourself. And so I just tunneled into the idea of me looking at myself from a vantage point of view, which was nowhere. So you get this dissociative cycle, and you come in a very weird situation. And I remember really had to tear myself off the mirror. I was really sweating and heart beating. It was like, whoa, what was that? It was like this weird, and that was characterized as a typical weird experience, something which you really remember for a long time, like, what was that? And you want to try and get it, and it's very ontological. It's a thing, it's a situation. And years later, I stumbled upon a work of Dan Graham in a museum. And in that work, it's called Performance Audience Mirror, a very conceptual, but also a very probing piece. So he stands in front of a mirror, and there's an audience in front of him, and he just comes on stage, and then he just starts describing every move and action he does. So he's sort of echoing everything he does, and then he sort of shifts to echoing the audience response to him, and then he turns around to the mirror, and then he's looking at himself and talking about that, and talking about the audience in the mirror. And it's very, what is the word? It's like he's inducing a trance, and it resembles sort of certain shamanistic practices of this. It's like this hyper focus, and really bringing you into this very conscious state of mind. And you can see the audience going through waves of acceptance, sort of first laughing, then they go silent, then they're like uncomfortable, and then they go really concentrated. And that was great. That was like, oh wow, this art thing is where you can research these weird mirror experience, for instance. And I've always, it's been for me, that's why I went that way instead of theology or something else, because it's such a practical way of working with exploring the weird. And that was a 70s work. And later over the years, I was studied in the 90s. I'm from 73, so I was too young to sort of be there firsthand. There's a different taste to the works in that era. And of course, your high weirdness very much focuses on 70s, well, psychonauts, writers, and conspiracy writers. And there's even a show on Apple TV called 1971, I think. It's about music from that era. It's also emphasizing this peculiarity of that time. Could you talk a bit about why do you think it's such a special time?
Yeah, no, it was nice to see those pieces in your show. You know, particularly how like with the Vasulka stuff, you can see how electronics become a way, like the development of electronics and the development of the idea of what psychedelic vision is like are this, you know, they're deeply woven into one another. Not just that people use media to create psychedelic effects in films, you know, to signify a psychedelic trip, but that actually the internal dynamics of psychedelic experience themselves partly get modeled on these things. So we start, again, there's an operation of recirculation. And it's always important to remember that while psychedelics can produce tremendous novelty in things you've never seen before, images that you can't trace anywhere, that they are also very much embedded in this kind of recursion of social and cultural expectations and cues. It's not
just briefly interrupt you. I'm very sorry. Jose, could you run a bit of the Vasulkas for the audience to see? Sorry. Yeah, that's fine.
Is simultaneously a kind of psychedelic vision zone and just the new world that electronics are going to add and translate the existing world into. And so there's a one of the peculiar tastes of the 70s that you particularly see in art, in conceptual art. So this is, you know, there's the time of like a certain kind of often slightly inhumanist conceptual art, like where it's not expressive, it's not romantic, it's like practices, procedures that are whittling down things. And at the same time, it's this florid era, it's a feverish era where things are going excessive. And there's a very interesting tension there that I think that Dan Graham's, that piece is amazing because he's doing something to himself, right? So he's a subject, and yet by narrating it, looping in everybody, and so everybody gets to go on the ride. And what is he doing? On one level, he's radically distancing an aspect of himself from himself, you know, taking advantage of that dissociation feature that's part of the glass, but then expanding it and intensifying it, making it more kind of multidimensional. And yet, as you say, the irony or the paradox is that even through this very like descriptive, self-transcending abstraction, it ends up being a little shamanic. It ends up being a bit trance-like. And so that's one way of really understanding the 70s. For example, psychology in the 70s was all about altered states. So you have a huge aspect of regular academic psychology where people like studying monks and trying to figure out how to do, so you have this zone where you suddenly realize that there's all these altered states that are available through meditation and through psychedelics and through other kinds of practices. And you have the further development of technology, monitoring, scientific languages, and those two things like weave together in psychology, but also in art. And what he was doing there is a wonderful example of how to take advantage of the tension between these multiple registers to do something that is, still quite remarkable.
Yeah, I agree. Is that maybe the post-60s? It's like the end of that dream of the 60s, and it becomes this sort of but everything is continuing, but it's just losing an ideology somehow and becoming fragmented. And that's exactly why the weird is so beautiful, because the weird doesn't have a voice, right? It's not good or bad. The weird is just there. So it becomes colder and sort of more an experience without any ideology. And maybe the 70s was just
people trying to respond to that
to happen. Or
I think people were trying to respond to recognizing that condition and to, so there was fragmentation, so there was lots of creativity in multiple directions. And overall what you're seeing is a transformation of the counterculture, which was never one thing, but still there was a unifying dream in many ways, whether it was consciousness or revolution. There was a sort of unifying dream of radical historical transformation just on the horizon. That doesn't happen. So counterculture becomes subculture, myriad subcultures, each of which are sort of mining their own edge or their own sort of undermining or their own new intensity. Like, the new age arises in this era as well, often inspired by psychedelic experiences, which then they later don't really talk about as they go and create their sort of quasi religions in the 1980s. So all that's happening. And then also something is happening to us, that we are becoming probed, monitored, and scanned in a new way. You have UPC symbols, you have the emergence of computers that are used to track consumer debt and to track consumers. You have ultrasound in hospitals emerging. There's a way in which the sort of technosphere begins to monitor and even sort of stimulate the self, the subject. And that becomes part of the fun and glory and feverishness of the 70s, but it also, I think, partly explains the coldness of its science fiction, which you can also see. So it's a really interesting era that way. And for me, it's the most resonant era for our current moment, which, on some level, there's nothing like the singularity of our moment, but history always feels that way. But the 70s have a lot of shared, I think, feelings. There's a revolutionary, there's still this sort of sense of revolutionary possibility, but it's kind of like becoming hard to distinguish from nihilism. There's concerns about the environment. There's concerns about energy. Terrorism, enters the sort of, media world. There's, the emergence of computer networks, and, so there's a lot of things that I think resonate across time. And that's partly what the rise of conspiracy and paranoia, very important part.
Jose, could you launch Sabrina Rattay on the background? You can just stop it when it's finished. And Great, that was Sabrina Rattay. Just want to show that because it so such resembles the Fasukas, and she's also outspokenly fan of the Fasukas. But it is a work of, I'm sorry, out of hand, but it's like the last 10 years, so it's quite recent. I wanted to use that as a bridge also because the Fasuka work somehow felt, because it's so, just like, I'm sorry guys, I've been running, because it's so probing, performative, sort of looking for this different dimension. It's very honest, and it's just about material and looking and sort of phenomenology in art, but using technology. And sort of, was that the dream of the cyberdelic movement, or was it different?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's been a connection between cybernetics and psychedelia that starts to be articulated already in the 1960s, even in the earlier 60s, in the sense that some of the early computer development in the Bay Area, there were people involved who were already part of the psychedelic movement. In 1967, the Hate Street hippie magazine is called The Oracle, this huge, multicolored, hard to read, total hippie paper. And there's some articles about cybernetics in there, and it's in the Whole Earth catalog. So that whole Earth worldview, again, very California looking forward. That was the utopian moment of our contemporary technological dystopia. And so there's always been this kind of cybernetic element. And I think that later on, particularly in the 90s, this was taken up as much more of a visible field. And I think the idea was that it was sort of like the worlds that are being concocted, discovered, established, opened through technology were sort of inevitably going to make the utopian and just sort of marvelous other worlds of psychedelics more available, more real, more, again, even just kind of more circulated. But for people who still had utopian ideas about psychedelics as sort of transformations that would have a global effect and things like that, which was an important part of the 60s and 70s, and still partly out there now, partly in the contemporary psychedelic renaissance, has some utopian elements in it for all its commerce and hype. That just became more obviously part of the move, in the way that the technology itself became more enchanted. So I think, like in the 60s, it wasn't like the computers were enchanted. But in the 90s and going forward, the technologies themselves are increasingly part of this kind of enchanted weave that has something to do with cybernetics, which on a simpler level, which underlies some of the work we're looking at, is just about iteration and feedback and recursivity. Even the Dan Graham pace, what's he doing? He's like making himself an object through a recursive operation of self-description. So there's something very abstract and clean about this feedback, iterative self-reference that you see in psychedelic visions, the fractal elements that keep referring to each other, in hyper-modern media culture where things just refer to each other, and you watch cartoons and all they do is refer to other cartoons, and there's this kind of looping self-referential circularity that's intoxicating and also toxic. And in a way, it's our pharmacon. you know, that ancient Greek idea of the poison that's also a cure depending on dose, is that our pharmacon is some kind of problem of self-reference that gets lost in its sort of incestuous ness, and also is almost the way to a kind of transcendence that is actually technologically feasible rather than a merely sort of spiritual register. And I think you feel that, and I feel that dynamic going on in a lot of contemporary works that recirculate lots of elements. It's this kind of driving, almost apocalyptic sense of cyberdelia, stripped away from, you know, very obviously positive visions and more towards the weird or the dark or the sinister. But it's really the circulation and the mutation and the cheap cut and paste, you know, the way that the cheap cut and paste that people do, you know, 12-year-old kids do to make a dumb meme, that sort of actually has this weird power. And it is this power of the banal, but it's also something more sinister than that, but maybe it isn't. Those kinds of affects, I think, are really key to our moment. Not the easiest things to look at, but again, that's what I really like about the digital weird, is it's playing with that stuff in some very interesting ways.
There's maybe, yeah, so as you said, that there's something also we discussed earlier. There's then, you have, like in the Fossilkas in Sabrina Rattay, you have this maybe more ontological approach to the technology, and it's something in my own work I found so very important. It's also something which was coined the technological sublime, but then more in a sort of romantic classical way. Weird is way better, where you sort of just ponder on the unfathomable speed or the size of the net or the magic of it, the hyperlink, which in the 90s we were like entranced by, and but then in the 21st century it shifts very much to the sort of content and this as you said, feedback looping of ideas, and of course the information weirdness, just the sort of as you have to, like with Robert Owen Wilson, this Discordianism has become the norm in a way, right? It's crazy. It's like,
how did that happen? Yeah,
that happened. That went so far. Yeah. It came, some sort of social media came, and suddenly we were all, this is the new norm. You have presidents who endorse it. It's crazy. Yeah, maybe there's another work we can show about that, which it will be fun. There's probably Kid Anthrax is the most crazy one. We'll have to take just do a short 20-second view of it, maybe. It's cool. Yep, cool. Yeah, so that was psychomanthium, I believe, and a concoction of everything you could, if you just dive into Reddit deep enough, that's sort of where you end, and you may never come back, which happens to a lot of people nowadays. Could be your neighbors.
I mean, it's amazing how a certain kind of power and attraction that you could call esoteric has become part of this culture. It's very, as someone who's like studied esotericism as a historical topic, and you can see continuity. I mean, this piece explicitly invites the viewer into a kind of delirium that has a potential divinatory power. I mean, it's the whole idea is that you're kind of mixing and matching modern sigils in a way that allows for possibly some kind of glimpse of some other order or an alterity or a vision of what is to come or what is actually going on. And there's some way in which the whole, the internet has sort of, in a way, unintentionally become a place for that kind of rabbit holing and that kind of the tension between the veil, the secret, and the revelation, which helps explain a lot of conspiracy theory. It's always, one thing when I did a lot of talking about conspiracy theory all last year, got a little tired of it even because there's no winning. That one aspect of it is just that you know something, you have a secret, you've had a Gnostic vision, how the world really works. And all the other mechanisms that come in to tell you, well, maybe it doesn't really work that way. It's like, that's part of the lie. That's part of the conspiracy. So it's a very powerful subject position. It's very attractive because it gives you a sense of coherence. I know something. And my knowledge also explains my alienation. I know something that the world doesn't acknowledge. That's why I'm alienated. That's why nobody listens to me, or I have a difficult life or whatever. And I can be superior to all the people who are still buying the lie. And it's a very attractive, in the sense of an attractor in the systems. It's an easy attractor, not easy, but it's a powerful one. And, again, in the past, you'd see it in, paranoia, conspiracy theory, marginal cultures, psychedelic excess, psychopathology. And now it's just that attractor is just in the general information stream. And it's very, I think it's a really important thing to wrestle with.
Yeah, definitely. Would you say, if you would compare it to the 70s, because the 70s had, of course, it was like a cacophony of cults and sort of weird, resonating small groups of craziness like we see. This would be the digital version of it, which is the sort of networked version. Do you see any esoteric differences if you would compare?
Yeah, there's some real differences. I mean, one is just the social form isn't there. So you don't have the interiority of a specific group that's located in space and time. And there's also, it tends to be less strictly ideological. I mean, I think that Q is really the important example here, because while it all hooks on some idea of Trump as a savior, Trump himself is not doing Q. He's not the guru. He's off stage in the sense of the actual discourse going on. So that's really important. The other important thing to look at Q is that because it is a network, that you can throw anything in it. And that allows all these different types of people to find a kind of connection there. And that's another part of Q that we tend not to see, because we just see a bunch of rabid racists and fools, is that it's actually this great umbrella. People from all over the world, suburban moms, Christians, pagans, people who know a lot about technology and science, people who are just into, the spiritsmen, new agers, alternative healers. They all have a place there because it's networked. So it doesn't have the consistency of the classic cult. And indeed, sociologists who study cults have noticed a distinct decline in the traditional form of cults from the 70s. We still see them, NXIVM or whatever, like they still happen. But overall, it's not comparable, because we're moving into this kind of network model, which is, in a way, maybe a little bit less like, it's not as visible, it's not as focused, it's not as condensed, and it's not as rooted in space and time. It's not as like locked. into a particular proximity to the guru, to the family, or to the group. And so it becomes in a way more like ideology, but it's not really like an ideology that we're really used to, because it's more of this kind of associational network effect, and its reach is unimaginable. You just don't know how far it goes. How many people who work in the Pentagon are more or less Q people? I don't know.
No, it's
thousands.
okay.
I don't know,
Yeah, that's the crazy stuff. Time is ticking. We're going to just briefly look at the two last videos, and I'll just sort of add some stuff to it. Maybe Jose, could you run a little bit of Rachel's video?
One, two, three. How do you feel?
Okay.
One word. How do you feel deep down inside? One word.
I don't know. Well, lonely maybe.
Lonely, huh?
Like, yeah, this may look like a sparkly unicorn, but it's a little bit more perverted than that. So it was a familiar. In fact, I was sent a link to it to some friends who were burners and stuff, because they were like,
"Oh, that's so cool." Thank you. Yeah, we just saw Rachel McLean's excerpt of her video in the show, and also, we were just discussing the interesting unicorn meets pervert aspect of it. Also, I kind of like the bringing back the Dan Graham and my experience, the mirror, which is sort of a classic conduit to the weird. Mm-hmm. On many levels. It also has a certain element of magic and sorcery to the mirror, also in many stories. And here as well, there is. So I was just also wondering, because we were talking about a digital weird, and the weird, I think you and I sort of resonate well and know is a very experiential thing of it. It's also about embodiment. It's body and the world, and now we're stuck to these screens, and the embodiment aspect is a real problem there. Of course, we're working really hard on the immersiveness of it, but still that's a different thing. So is there is that the end of the ontological weird experience, or are we just looking from a wrong angle? What do you think?
No, I mean, I think, since we're focusing on digital work and media, it's going to have that tendency to be more about the recirculation and the commutation and the mashups and all of that. But those same logics are also operating in the sort of interface between the digital or the media or the human and the inhuman cosmos, which itself is in my mind the source of the real weird. I was just hiking yesterday in Mount Tam up in Marin County, and then like most of my visual experience is like in a way extremely generic and like slightly romantic, like the beautiful redwoods and and I'm feeling good in my body and things are going nice trail and there's not too much poison oak and everything's kind of, and then just at the end, after a few hours of hiking, we came across this log and there was this fungus, I think, and it was about like the size of a softball. And it was mostly like a crusty custard consistency, but there were a few openings where there was this oozing yellow stuff. I mean, it was so weird. And I've never seen that before. Like I've never seen that before. And then there it is. And we're like, God. So you have like, that's weird. What is it? Weird. Yeah. Well, who's going to, why does nature do that? I don't think it's alien, but it sure looks alien. And so I have hope that the kind of circulation you see inside the digital weird, it's, to my mind, it's usually more interesting when it leans out And there is an attempt to kind of connect with the weirdness that's in the inhuman cosmos that we're plugged into. So I take great solace in a lot of developments in, people engaging plants in new ways, people engaging, cosmic cycles, inhuman forces, and even when you get back to this idea of like the Vesocals do, what are they doing? They're taking in sensory signals from the world, the city in their case, and translating them or having some kind of like operation on those signals in order to produce an artifact. Well, of course, you can do that with like the myriad of signals coming from the inhuman outside that now we're tapping into. So I think that the two things are working more hand in hand rather than a full enclosure. I do feel that individuals have the propensity to get lost into excessively human recirculation and cut themselves off from the possibility of the kinds of encounters that I think shaped you and I. That might be in my generation speaking, can't say, but that's sort of how I kind of approach it.
Yeah. Jose, the last one. Could you show us a small sample of Adam Farmawi's work?
Hi, I'm so happy you're here. So today mostly we'll be talking about contouring. I've toned and moisturized already. I'm concealing using my True Match concealer in Vanilla. Now, let's highlight using a flat brush. I'm just going to apply to the areas that I want to bring forward, which will help me create that nice natural glow. I always do a triangle under my eyes. Contouring depends on your face shape, which areas you want to pull forward and which you want to recede. So if there's a certain part of your face you don't like, for example, you think your nose is too big and you want to slim it down, I'll show you how to make it bigger and make a feature, a real conversation point. So this is the lighter part, and now we're going to go in and contour to sculpt the face. You can customize to your own face shape and just hide whatever you feel like. For example, your nose or your mouth. You don't really need them. You can see here how I'm sculpting the field, hiking under the cheekbone. You might not have a cheekbone to start with. You might be a fridge or a mobile phone. Face cream slips into fat and oil. Be careful as it oozes, pus scratching and scraping along a femur, pricking the skin, sliding the soap, the oil and the scum across its surface. Can you see how once it's blended, it creates more dimension to the onion? Milk chocolate cutting through the wrapper. A lot of people find where their cheekbone is by placing their finger into the hollow, finding a gap, a hole, and contour there.
Back to school.
Okay, so now it's time for a full body highlight. I generally do this using shaving foam. Starting at the mouth, extending out over the nose, cheeks, forehead, over the hairline, down over the collarbone, and let's not forget the hands. Tips for healthy.
Yeah, that was the last video we're just going to throw in, just last excerpt. And here we want to just sort of bridge to also next talk we're going to have in a month is with Elvia Wilk. And we will bring in, we'll be looking into also sort of the new weird, the literary genre, and also look into sort of how feminism is manifesting with, of course, the old weird being a more masculine work of another time. And this isn't sort of using politics and sort of activism in utilizing the weird. It's a really weird video. He goes all the way, but he's clearly presenting it as a very normal YouTube video and bringing all that culture and trying to break norms by going completely grotesque. That must have a history, Erik. How do you see that?
Well, one of the things I liked about this piece a lot is that it wasn't just a parody of, makeup videos, or there's another, way of thinking about just like all, and there's this huge genre, that's a lot of what people do. But it was also like, it ends up being this kind of meditation on the narcissism of wellness and self-care. And that's where I thought it started to take on like a really good bite. And so at first I thought he was just kind of screwing with the form, and I was like, no, this is actually quite well conceived, because like, you know, like a lot of things, a little bit of wellness is good. A little bit of self-care is good. If you don't do any self-care, you're probably screwed. You should, you know, some of us do yoga, or we do meditation, no problem, you know, whatever. But as a feature of contemporary consumer capitalism, and as a desperate attempt of the sort of broken, fragmenting individual subject to sustain itself in the face of dystopia, wellness is a you know, a pretty obscene symptom. And so here you get to see the obscenity. Wellness makes monsters. That's my subtitle for this piece. Wellness makes monsters. And not that there's anything wrong with monsters in a larger sense, but that kind of, again, it's an aspect of recirculation that just goes crazy. And it reminded me a little bit of like when you see people who've had a lot of work done, like a lot of cosmetics, right? A lot of cosmetics, and like a little bit's pretty good. Hey, it looks pretty good. That one, oh, it's a little okay. And then you get into the uncanny valley, and you're like, what does this mean?
Yeah, totally.
Can I make it allegory of that? It's not just about women's faces or bodies or what's driving them. I mean, it's something more about the nearness of the monstrous in ourselves. And like, so in a way, it's not letting us off the hook, like, oh, those people over there, they're monsters, and we're keeping a nice, no, that's not going to work. And then that touch at the end, which I don't think we saw in the but the very end, the very last scene, there's like these little worms eating on the screen, and they're kind of cheesy, but they're still really gross because we're like absolutely disgusting. And it was just this reminder about mortality, but in a really fun way. I don't know. I thought that was again, a really great piece that sort of makes itself a symptom of something that's political and social, but in a funny, artful way that still really bites. And yeah, so I thought that was a terrific piece.
Great, man. Well, thanks for the talk. This little arc will end. We're going to open up to Sanneke and Nimrod and anybody who sent a question, and I'll shut up.
Yeah, so indeed, for everyone at home, there's the video or the YouTube chat where you can post your questions, and we'll bring them through Erik directly. Yeah, this was such a wonderful ride. That's the first thing I want to say. And now how we did it like this, I also see the power of the artist as a sort of guide into the weird. And that's a wonderful thing. Also, the way they can question mortality and make that something that is more a transformative process. And I think that's also what you see a lot when Elvia talks of the new weird. Like you often think it's about death, but actually is it not about transformation? And that makes death also something less terrible. And for me, art can really be a spiritual guide towards this process of like, yeah, that's just a personal remark. But yeah, I think your talk set this out so beautifully.
Can I sorry.
Go
ahead. So just to resonate, just to say thank you very much. It's been really mind-blowing and eye-opening. I wanted at the beginning to ask a question about, you know, with the theme of realities, but you've touched on I think so many layers of realities. So maybe kind of taking more personal and kind of towards the me and my first kind of experience, the first time you hear someone referring to you as weird. And then with that context is this kind of, and for me, I think probably it was when I was 3 or 4, whatever. And I think it happens to many people that works in the arts. And that's what kind of one decision-making of the process that leads us to work within this environment that might not be this kind of your traditional. But I think my question is about the moment where the singular experience of weirdness becomes a collective experience of weirdness. And whether the private secret, as you say, about the conspiracy theories, that we know the truth, but then everybody at the point as this weirdness moves from that kind of realms of the personal to the collective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always, in some ways, going on all the time. I mean, if you look at like the origin of the idea of like an esoteric secret, it's usually inside of a group, and in fact part of a planned performance where you as the initiate go through some kind of weird experience, you know, where things are upsetting or strange or terrifying, or and you get a vision or you get some information, but it's all kind of organized in a way too. So I think there's a real collective dimension all along. And in terms of conspiracies, of course, without getting the feedback and support of the new networks that you're identifying with, it's not really, you know, it takes it's a rare soul who goes out and actually is a conspiracy theorist, meaning they're building their own connection and they're putting out their own vision. That's relatively rare. It's the people who then just kind of pick their fan, you know, they're like fans of which view you have, and that's a very collective collective process as well. And it's also really interesting when it happens in physical space, like what happens when an audience or a crowd or a group of revelers sort of collectively enter into something that's a bit uncanny. Or, you know, practicing magicians, this is one of the ways, you know, they may have all these ideas about this God and this practice and this history and whatever, but a lot of what, you know, when it comes down to it, it's like, can we get together with a group of people and create an environment that we all feel is non-normal in some way, and that is actually transformative and changing. So I think that dynamic is going on all the time, but there is something else about the collectivity that's happening now, like the immensity of the recirculation, or like what if you go down a Reddit rabbit hole, it's just, there's so many people, there's so many posts, they're kind of the same and each one's different. There's a kind of multiplication of not the crowd, but, you know, the collective, that itself feels like it's taking on a weird quality in a new way. And I do think that's something new about our experience, maybe because of the internet, where there's something about that. It's almost like if you see a single ladybug, it's really cute. It's a little ladybug. But if you see 10,000 ladybugs swirling before you on the ground, it's horrifying. So there's something about multiplicity that gets us to that weird space, even if the units of the multiplicity are, you know, ordinary, not threatening items. And I feel like the internet, because so much of it is about exploiting large numbers and translating us into large numbered networks, that we're feeling a little bit of that quality, that 10,000 ladybug quality, just throughout our ordinary lives, and that there's something going on there that is different than previous relationships of like the individual to the collective.
But then, so to continue that conversation, this idea that there's also a competition within these collectives of who gets weirder and weirder, and you can see that on Reddit as well. When you have within the conspiracy theories subreddit, you have that one that have a very, very long thread that puts the whole world, the whole weirdness, as much as possible within that thread to make a point and to show that they are the most prolific or the most weird. But yeah.
Absolutely. No, the same arms race is happening in all these domains, and that quest for the edge. And that's what I was saying earlier about deviancy, is it's just harder and harder to find something to actually deviate from that has some kind of consistency. Or, so people will pretend, well, those people over there, so we're still subverting, and it's like, I grew up in the 90s, so like subversion was everywhere. It's everything's being subverted, and the sort of edge of it, and the kind of black leather jacket coolness of being a subverter of cultural codes. And it's like, we're getting to the point where you're like, that's what cultural codes are doing, is they're just constantly subverting themselves now as a kind of engine. It's partly automatic, it's partly algorithmic. And then at these edges, it's still being driven. Oh, I can out paranoia you with this twist, and then like as a sort of like somebody who perversely enjoys conspiracy theory, although less so after QAnon, I got kind of sick of it, but someone who used to, when you see a particularly pathological one, there's a kind of brilliance to it, like well, that's a cool move you've made. And so that eating around the edges of stuff, I think, is a really it's a strange thing about our situation, because there's not a lot of real estate left. It's there and it's important, and yes, there are a lot of codes that still deserve to be fully subverted, but it doesn't happen. It's a deeper process. I mean, I almost feel like the real subversion is like the actual construction of postmodern subjectivity as this kind of still functioning individual who's making decisions, sort of, and being asked to consume and have desires that produce consumption, but the whole thing is kind of breaking down, and you're like let's subvert that, not just in a nihilistic way. In my view, I'm a little bit more of a hippie, but I appreciate the nihilistic sort of call in the situation that we're in.
Can I go back to a topic that was touched upon long ago, but I was curious of, and that is in regard to the Vesukas, because when you talk of the Vesukas in regard to the weirds, what we talked about was clearly a reflection on the analog. I rewatched an interview with them recently, and they also said it was like entering the electronic world. And it was also a lot of the analogy of the machine. There was a box that you could open, you could switch buttons and explore this world. And that is maybe quite in opposition to the digital that we also came to talk about, in which the box is so closed off. And even, I think they also call it like going from the analog to the digital is like going through brain surgery or something like that. So I was just wondering how you see this analog digital opposition in regard to the weird.
Yeah, I've thought about that one a lot. I haven't actually addressed it in terms of the weird, so it's a really good question. But I definitely feel that is a very significant difference, that shift. And I say that partly as a Gen Xer, in the sense that I grew up in an analog world. In many ways, my generation is the last generation to fully grow up in an analog world. I mean, I remember seeing big DEC 10 computers at my dad's. He was a scientist at his office, but in like 1975, and starting to play like the earliest dungeon games on the computer. So I was aware of that computer. So it's always been very clear to me that the distinction between those. And then I'm a big music fan, so you can hear it all the time. The whole debate about digital versus analog, or LPs, or just talking about analog electronics. And there's the whole revival of modular synthesis, because people have a yearning for the analog. And that, so for digital subjects, the analog in a weird way becomes a kind of stand-in for nature. Even though it's like, a huge Euro rack of modular synthesis is hardly equivalent to, the crashing waves at the beach. It, for us as digital subjects, becomes a kind of portal to tactility, a timbre, a flavor, a density, a sort of wave-like quality, a hypnotic quality that has a different flavor than strictly digital devices. And so there's a weirdness in that. I think the nostalgia in that is also a weirdness. I'm thinking of some bands who use really garishly oversaturated analog effects to create a kind of too muchness, or a haziness, or a sludginess. That is, I think, part of the weird, is like being drawn in there. So again, but what it refines is what is then specifically the digital weird. And just from the conversation we've been having today, I tend to think about that, the operation of multiplication and the operation of networking and of recirculation, of intense recirculation. Feedback and all that happens inside an analog world too, but there's I don't know, it's difficult. It's a very, very interesting question, but I think that the analog is partly a site for weirdness for digital subjects, in a way that just 2 generations ago, you're like, what are you talking about? It's just a record. What's the big deal?
I have an idea. I think the analog very much is very visceral. It's again very much about embodiment, whereas the digital, it's these bits and data are being performed in these endless windows and software. It's more dreamlike. It's more a mental, dreamy state. And I think we're missing the body part, but it's in a way trippy in itself. endless performance of these processors just conjuring up images and worlds, and I think that's the difference. But that's also why people get a stiff back and get annoyed about it. That's probably a different weird.
It's funny, I'm just looking in the chat, which I, because of our talk, completely had forgotten about, and Martijn van Boven turns out to be exactly on the same topic that we are now on. So he was like saying technology nowadays is more boxed in, and it can be less used to investigate from the ground up, starting from the electronic or digital signal. Digital machines have a very static form, and how you interface with it. How do you see this? So I think we touched upon this. So thanks for that, Martijn.
That's one of the things that I think that artists can do as well, is to figure out how to generate. And I knew that a lot of people were doing this in the net art days in the 90s, when I was more familiar with the scene of how you sort of like you sort of move in and create new interfaces that do open up to questions or spaces that are unmapped, because there's so much pressure into like, just trust the black box. Press this button, get what you want out of the black box. And so the way in which an artist can knowing the system, recognize and make an intervention and make an actual opportunity to re-investigate whatever out of this sort of tendency to just draw, to kind of just fall in and trust the black box, which is, we're just starting with the black box. Black box that we're staring into the screen of right now. But when AI kicks in, there's going to be black boxes everywhere. On the phone. Hey, what happened to all the money in my account? I don't know. The computer we just asked, it said, yeah, I don't know. Black boxes all the way down, just like turtles in the old myth.
Excellent.
Just to add on that, I think, well, many of the artists that we do work with that's exactly what they do. They take the technologies and really make it elastic and try to push as much as possible to boundaries, and to always question their role and the role of technology within society and culture and so forth. And that's what's really fascinating, to see every new technology being produced or given, whether it's a website, social media, or an actual kind of equipment being really, really tested to the ground from both physicality and conceptual.
Definitely.
Yeah, here. Sanneke, anything else in the? No, then it's late. I think we should grant Erik a break, poor man. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for this great talk. I hope the audience enjoyed this. I certainly did. And as I said, next month we'll have Elvia Wilk over. We'll have hopefully Rebecca back. She will be leading that conversation. And thank you, Sanneke and Jose, for hosting this evening.
Thanks, everyone. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Erik, and thanks for watching.
Have a good
see
day.
you in a month. Yeah.
Bye-bye.